Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into the life of a truly fascinating and often misunderstood First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln.
She's definitely one of those figures in American history that people have really strong opinions about.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
We're going to try to get beyond the surface today, exploring what made her so controversial, but also, how her story reflects the pressures faced by First Ladies really throughout history.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting is that with Mary Todd Lincoln, we really see how much those pressures have changed over time.
Right. And our main source for this deep dive is this captivating episode of the American History Tellers podcast. It's a really great narrative style, so it's not, a dry history lesson by any means.
I listened to it a few times, actually, to prepare, and it's really well done.
Yeah, it definitely paints a vivid picture, doesn't it?
Hmm.
So let's start at the beginning, shall we? Mary Todd was born in Kentucky to a wealthy family, but her childhood, it's described as desolate in the podcast.
Yeah, that really struck me, too. I mean, losing her mother at a young age and then having a strained relationship with her stepmother. Can't imagine how that must have shaped her.
Right. It's definitely something to consider when you're trying to understand her personality later on. But amidst all that, she had this exceptional education, which was, unusual for women at the time.
Yeah, her father was a politician himself, and he was a big believer in educating women, which, wasn't the norm then.
And I love that they share this little anecdote in the podcast about how Mary, as a young girl, refused to meet President Andrew Jackson because she disagreed with his policies.
I know, right? It's like, even then, she had these strong opinions and wasn't afraid to voice them.
Hmm.
Definitely a sign of things to come.
Absolutely. And then there's this famous quote from her teenage years. Apparently, she said, and I quote, "Mrs. President or victim of false prophets, talk about setting your sights high."
I mean, that's pretty remarkable to have that kind of ambition so early on. It definitely speaks to a certain drive, a certain determination that you see throughout her life.
Yeah, it makes you think, did she see the role as just, a position of power, or was it more about, a platform to make a difference?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think it was probably a combination of both. And that ambition, you really see it come into play with her relationship with Abraham Lincoln.
Hmm.
Talk about an unlikely match.
He was like this self-made lawyer from humble beginnings, and she came from a prominent, well-educated family. It's, kind of the classic opposites attract scenario.
Right, and the podcast emphasizes that Mary was the one who really pursued him. She saw potential in Lincoln that maybe others didn't, and she was determined to make him succeed.
It really flips the script on the traditional narrative, right? Instead of this social climber just wanting to marry into power, she actually saw something special in him. But of course, their courtship was anything but smooth sailing.
Oh, yeah. The podcast mentions that they even broke off their engagement at one point. And Lincoln was apparently devastated, fell into a deep depression.
Talk about drama. It's a reminder that these historical figures, they were real people with real emotions and struggles, just like us.
Exactly. And their eventual reconciliation in marriage speaks to a certain, I don't know, a certain resilience, a certain commitment to each other despite those challenges.
Absolutely. But even after they got married, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. They had, their share of domestic difficulties. And Mary, she had this reputation for having a temper. Plus, they struggled to keep household staff.
I can only imagine the stress of managing all of that, especially with the added pressure of Lincoln's political career.
Right, and that's where you really start to see Mary's strength and determination shine through. The podcast describes her as, and this is a great analogy, like a toothache, keeping her husband awake to politics.
I love that. It really captures her role as his, like, confidant and advisor, right? Always pushing him to think about his career, to strategize, to make moves.
And this was during a time when, women were expected to be seen and not heard, especially in politics. But Mary, she defied those expectations.
Totally. And that's part of what makes her so fascinating. She wasn't content to just sit back and be a quiet, supportive wife. She had her own opinions and wasn't afraid to share them, even if it meant ruffling some feathers.
Oh, yeah, she definitely ruffled some feathers. Like with that incident with Julia Trumbull, her friend, whose husband ended up defeating Lincoln in a Senate race.
And that was it for their friendship. Mary, she saw it as a betrayal and couldn't forgive her.
It just shows how deeply invested she was in their shared goals, She wouldn't tolerate disloyalty, even from a friend.
And then, of course, you have the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were a major turning point in Lincoln's career.
Even though he lost that particular election, those debates put him on the national map. You can bet Mary was right there beside him, offering advice and support every step of the way.
Absolutely. She was his champion, his strategist. And as his star rose, her lifelong dream of becoming First Lady, it seemed closer than ever.
But as we'll see, achieving that dream came with a whole new set of challenges and controversies. So, before we move on to that chapter, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to remember about Mary's early life?
Well, I think it's her unwavering ambition, her determination to succeed, and her willingness to push boundaries in a world that wasn't always receptive to strong-willed women. It's a really powerful reminder that even in the face of adversity, women can make their mark on history.
Well said. So it's 1861, and after a long journey, the Lincolns finally arrive in Washington, D.C.,
Right at the heart of it
a
all.
nation on the brink of civil war, and Mary is stepping into this role she is, literally dreamt of her whole life, First Lady.
Can be a mix of emotions, right? Excitement, but also the weight of the world on her
And I
shoulders.
can only imagine. And then almost immediately, she throws herself into this big project.
Redecorating the White House.
Exactly. Which, looking back, it seems kind of, I don't know, frivolous, given everything going on.
Yeah, but the podcast makes this point that to Mary, the White House was like a symbol
Oof.
of the nation, run down, neglected, kind of like the country felt at the time. So fixing it up, it was her way of like projecting strength, unity.
Interesting. But, of course, it doesn't go over well with everyone.
Oh, the spending. It becomes a huge scandal.
Like Parisian wallpaper scandal.
Right. And luxury furniture, a fancy new carriage, 4 horses, the whole shebang. It's a lot, especially when you've got...
A war about to break out.
Exactly. People are struggling, and here's the First Lady spending like there's no tomorrow.
Makes sense why it rubbed folks the wrong way. But to be fair to Mary, the podcast also talks about
Your compassion.
she'd visit wounded soldiers, bring them food, comfort, even write letters for those who couldn't.
It shows a different side to her, right? It wasn't all just appearances and fancy things.
So we've got this complex situation. Mary trying to do her duty as First Lady, elevating the White House and all that.
But also trying to acknowledge the very real suffering happening all around her.
It's a tough line to walk, and I think her actions were probably misinterpreted by a lot of people at the time.
Definitely. And then there's her involvement in political patronage, which was like unheard of for a First Lady at the time.
She was really stepping into uncharted territory, wasn't she?
Absolutely. She saw herself as a partner to Lincoln, not just a silent figurehead, and she wasn't afraid to use her influence.
There's even that story about her going behind Secretary of War Stanton's back.
Oh, yeah, to secure an army contract for one of her cousins. She was not messing around.
Like, move over, boys. I'm in charge now.
And of course, it sparked even more outrage, more whispers about her overstepping boundaries.
But again, you got to think about the context, right? Women in power were just not accepted back then. Any woman who dared to challenge that was going to face backlash.
Totally. And sadly, that backlash only intensified after another tragedy struck, the death of Willie, their son.
Typhoid fever, just awful. And Mary's grief, it was intense, very public.
She went into deep mourning, banned music from the White House, basically shut herself off from the world.
And people criticized her for that too, didn't they?
They said it was excessive, theatrical, another sign of her supposed instability.
It's so interesting how societal expectations around grief have changed, right? Today, we're much more open about expressing our emotions, but back then...
It was seen as weakness, especially for someone in Mary's position.
And then, in the midst of all this grief and scrutiny, she turns to spiritualism.
Which was gaining popularity at the time, lots of people seeking comfort in the idea of communicating with the dead.
Seances in the White House, trying to contact Willie. I mean, I can understand why she would do that, desperate for any kind of solace.
But of course, that too was used against her, seen as more proof of her mental instability.
It seems like she just couldn't catch a break no matter what she did.
And it really makes you wonder how much of it was genuinely about her behavior and how much of it was just, sexism and fear of a woman who wouldn't conform.
It's a question that still resonates today, doesn't it? We left off with Mary Todd Lincoln facing immense scrutiny, dealing with unbelievable grief. And then, the unthinkable happens.
The assassination of President Lincoln, a tragedy for the nation, but for Mary, it was, world-shattering.
It's hard to even comprehend, right? The deep dive really drives home how she blamed herself, thought her ambition, the pressure she put on Lincoln, somehow contributed.
That guilt on top of the grief, it's almost too much to bear.
And it's in this aftermath that we see, I think, Mary at her most vulnerable, retreating from public life, overwhelmed by grief, sometimes acting in ways that,
People saw as erratic, wandering hotel hallways, fears of being poisoned, that kind of thing.
and of course the whispers start again, the judgments about her mental state.
Which, again, you got to consider the time period. Women's emotions were so often dismissed, used against them.
Exactly. And then, to make matters worse, her financial struggles become public.
All those debts she'd been hiding, they come to light. And it just feeds into this narrative that she's irresponsible, unstable.
And then comes, honestly, the most shocking part of the whole story. Her own son, Robert, he tries to have her declared insane.
It's hard to wrap your head around. But what would drive a son to do that to his own mother?
The deep dive doesn't give a clear answer, but it definitely makes you think about the complexities of their family, the pressures of the time.
Some historians think Robert was genuinely concerned for her well-being. Others say maybe it was about protecting his own reputation or even gaining control of her money.
It's a reminder that history is messy, full of gray areas, and we may never know the full truth. But the trial itself, that's fascinating.
It really reveals a lot about how mental health was viewed back then.
They relied so heavily on these witness testimonies from people who'd observed Mary's behavior but had no medical expertise whatsoever.
And the verdict, 10 minutes. It makes you wonder if they'd already made up their minds before the trial even started.
Like Mary was already condemned in the court of public opinion.
Exactly, just another example of how women who didn't fit the mold were so often punished.
And the result, Mary is committed to an asylum, stripped of her property, her freedom.
It's a dark chapter, but thankfully it's not the end of her story. She eventually fights for her release. Another jury declares her sane.
She even travels to Europe, tries to rebuild her life away from all the judgment and scrutiny.
It shows a certain resilience, right? But the deep dive makes it clear that the losses, they never really left her.
Her health declines, and she spends her final years still wrestling with those ghosts of the past.
Mary Todd Lincoln dies in 1882, leaving behind a legacy that's still debated, reinterpreted to this day.
And that's what makes history so compelling, isn't it? We get to look back, analyze, try to understand these complex figures.
Mary Todd Lincoln, she was ambitious, controversial, compassionate, flawed, a product of her time, but also someone who challenged those very same norms.
Her story reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about real people with real emotions living through extraordinary circumstances.
And I think the most important takeaway is that we should resist easy judgments, embrace the nuances, the contradictions. That's how we truly learn from the past.
Well said. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our deep dive into the life of Mary Todd Lincoln. We hope you've enjoyed this journey through history. Be sure to check out the American History Tellers podcast for an even deeper exploration. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.